Throughout history, there were many different men and women who were executed in the most barbaric and sadistic ways. One of the most horrific was hanging, drawing and quartering, in which many people were dragged to execution scaffolds in towns and cities, and then an executioner would conduct the terrifying many stages of death. It was a shocking sight, and it often made witnesses sick, as the executioner hacked at the limbs of the condemned during the quartering stage, but it was done to send a very strict signal to people across the land not to rise up and get involved in serious crimes such as treason. It was a standard sentence for a traitor, but one man who was dragged to Tyburn for his execution was a priest, Father Thomas Reynolds, who would be subjected to this harrowing ordeal due to his religious beliefs. Join us today as we look at the execution of the hanged, drawn and quartered priest, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Thomas Reynolds was born around the year 1562 at around Oxfordshire. He would be a strong Catholic, and he left England to study to become a priest in Europe, and he travelled to France and then on to Spain, where he was one of the first students of the English college in Valladolid. He went on to study in Seville at another Jesuit college, and in 1592 he was ordained as a priest. He then went back to England and he would conduct Catholic services in the community, but at this time in the country, following the death of Elizabeth I, Catholic roundups continued and Catholic priests were being persecuted and were hunted. There were men such as Nicholas Owen who were tasked with building priest holes, in which the authorities raided the halls where priests were conducting underground preaching. The priests would then hide away and resist arrest until the authorities left. But it was a time in which a gunpowder plot emerged, with plotters and schemers such as Guy Fawkes and Robert Catesby plotting the assault on Parliament, which would have led to the King, James I and his royal family, being blown to kingdom come, along with all his government and half of London. Because of this, there were a strict wave of anti-Catholic legislations and measures brought in to outlaw worship and to keep people away from plotting. Thomas Reynolds would be limited in what he could do, and the gunpowder plot made his work more dangerous, and he would then at some point be exiled from England in the aftermath of the plot, as James I sent men away. There were many other Catholic priests at the time who were being executed in response to the plot, but Thomas Reynolds would later return to England, and he began ministering and preaching in private, and was kept away from the eyes of the authorities for a period of around 20 years. It's believed he may have used priest holes to hide out, but he was then in 1628 arrested. This was during the time of King Charles I's reign, and Reynolds was brought to trial and was sentenced to death for illegal worship. However, the Queen Henrietta Maria was a Catholic and was very ardent in her religious beliefs. She would manage to save Reynolds and she got him a reprieve. However, through this subsequent imprisonment, he was kept in rather decent conditions and was allowed a number of visitors. Many Catholics came to see him and they received his spiritual guidance, and in 1635 he was released from prison after he paid a bond after a number of years behind bars. He was actually allowed to preach and minister to local Catholics inside of London, and the Crown had many Catholic sympathies, and they were more tolerant of Catholics. But this did attract a huge amount of criticism, and the King's religious tolerance towards his people would be one of the reasons behind the English Civil War, and many were unhappy with Charles I. However, this was a troublesome time for the Stuart King, as Charles I recalled Parliament in 1640. Parliament was dominated by Puritans who hated Catholics. Catholics and priests were targeted because of this, and many were being locked up in prison. Trials and death sentences for Catholic priests continued, and one of these victims was Reynolds. The King would later launch the English Civil War, but Charles I had to flee London in January 1642 after he could not capture the rebel parliamentarians who had taken action against him, and London was in control of the parliamentarians. Because of this, they targeted Catholic priests, and Thomas Reynolds yet again was arrested. He was at the time around 80 years old, a very elderly man, and probably one of the oldest men across England. He was a quiet and reserved man, and was fearful of his impending execution, and he would want the ordeal to go rather quickly. He was tried and was condemned to be hanged, drawn and quartered, and before his execution, Father Reynolds spent the last few days of his life in prayer, confronted with his impending death. His execution took place on the 21st of January 1642, and in his final hours he came to terms with what was coming for him, and it would be one of the most horrific execution methods ever used in England. Along with another priest, Alban Rowe, Reynolds was secured to a hurdle, and he had then previously heard Mass, but he was then dragged behind a horse when he travelled from Newgate Prison to Tyburn, the site of his execution. The crowd looked on, and when he arrived at the execution scaffold, he spoke for around 30 minutes addressing the people who had gathered. He said that in his 40 years as a priest, no one could ever be found that would state Reynolds said anything treasonous, and he said he'd been aiming to reduce strayed souls to the folds of the Catholic Church. He stated that he had no wish to besmirch or get involved in the actions of Parliament, and he said that God would bless them, and he believed they would do what was best for England. He even prayed to the King and Queen that their kingdom would go from strength to strength, and he asked forgiveness of all those who he offended, and he thanked those who gave him this. Reynolds then turned to the sheriff who was overseeing his execution, and he thanked him for his patience, whilst he spoke to the crowd, and he said that God would reward him one day for making him a saint in heaven. The sheriff then spoke highly of Reynolds, and he said that he had never seen a man die like he was going to. This was an 80-year-old man, speaking peacefully, when he faced the most barbaric execution method. Having finished his speech, Thomas Reynolds then knelt down to pray, and he was placed in a cart, and along with the other priest, the pair embraced each other and recited the Miserere psalm as the cart pulled away. The noose had been secured around their necks as the cart was driven away, and the priests were then hanged from the gallows. It would have been expected that the executioner would then cut these men down before they expired and died, so their ordeal would continue, but the sheriff who was in control of the execution allowed Reynolds and the other priests to die from hanging on the gallows, so they would not feel the next horrific stages of their execution ordeal. He did this out of kindness, but the men were then cut down, dead, and they were then brought to the executioner's table on the scaffold. Here the men were disemboweled and dismembered. Before they were beheaded, they were then cut into 4 different pieces. At this point, many Catholics came forward, and they dipped their handkerchiefs in the blood of Father Thomas Reynolds to venerate these as a relic. The execution ordeal was horrific, and Reynolds' remains would then be dipped in tar, and they were sent to 4 different places to be hung up high in front of other people to act as a warning to others. It was a horrific execution, and let's remember this was an 80-year-old priest, a man who had lived a very peaceful life, who was subjected to this treatment. But it was a very turbulent time in English history, in which the English Civil War would become the most bloody conflict ever fought on English soil. But later, in 1929, Thomas Reynolds was beatified by the Pope, and he is today considered a martyr. Hanging, drawing and quartering was one of the most barbaric and horrific execution methods used in England, but the actions of the sheriff that day on the scaffold prevented the pious 80-year-old priest experiencing the horrors of his quartering after he was hanged from the gallows. This spared the priest a much more harrowing ordeal, but the latter parts of his execution still took place. It was a very shocking time in history, and in the years later, more blood would be shed during the English Civil War. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.